With the PlastiCharge, you add it to the Plastisol inks you already have. That sounds like an easy, low-hanging fruit solution for those who are trying to figure out if printing discharge is for them. Do we have the infrastructure for it? Is it something we can offer as a business decision? Welcome back. We've spoken previously about discharge base and all the multiple ways you can do it. Using it by itself to remove the shirt color to get a nice creamy look. Using it as an underbase under Plastisol instead of a white base. And then the last video in which we did the normal thing, which is adding pigments to the discharge base to do a multicolored discharge design. Today is the final thing that we want to talk about, which is the PlastiCharge additive, in which you can either use it by itself like a discharge base, but you can't add color to it, it's just a clear discharge, or for its intended use, which is adding it to a Plastisol ink. So I've been getting questions lately because I've been doing so much discharge and talking about PlastiCharge in general. Why would I want to do that instead of regular discharge? That looks so easy. And they're right. There is a lot of ease in doing standard discharge. But the joy of the Plastisol Discharge additive is that you don't need to invest in all of that, buying the pigments, making sure they don't dry, getting the discharge base, keeping everything safe in its own place. With the PlastiCharge, you add it to the Plastisol inks you already have. I mean, let's think about that for a moment. It's like, oh, I buy one product and I add that 50-50 to the Plastisol ink that I already have. That sounds like an easy, low-hanging fruit solution for those who are trying to figure out if printing discharge is for them. Do we have the infrastructure for it? Is it something we can offer as a business decision? What are the pitfalls and the good things about running PlastiCharge? Number one, you can still run PlastiCharge as that underbase discharge option. So this specifically, the PlastiCharge additive, has no binders, no resin. There's no solids in there that need to cure. All you need to do with this product is get it to fully evaporate. In the cure process of water-based inks, remember, it's evaporation and then time at cure. With the PlastiCharge, you kind of get to skip the time at cure. You go through the evaporation process, and with Plastisol ink, the Plastisol ink just needs to hit cure. So if your cure temperature on your Plastisol ink is 270 degrees, the ink just has to reach 270 after all the moisture has been fully evaporated so the Plastisol can bond to the fabric. Really important. Otherwise, your ink washes out. So that's the benefit to PlastiCharge. There's a lot of good reasons to use it. But if you decide you like discharge, go with the discharge base route. It's fantastic. Now, what are some of the drawbacks to PlastiCharge? Because you're adding it to your ink at a recommended initial mix ratio of 50-50 by weight, you're cutting your ink's opacity by half, which means that the ink you're starting with needs to be very, very opaque. Now, historically, the PlastiCharge product came about to be added to the Union Max Opaque colors, which are very, very opaque, high coverage values. And it works really well. But of course, all the other screen printers want to use the ink systems they're already using. So how do we do that? In today's case, we're going to be using the Ryonet inks, but I've also used this in International Coatings. I've used this in Rutland mixing systems. I've used this in QCM. I've used this in a number of ink brands, and it's always worked great. The trick to it is to know that you can add anywhere between 30% and 50% of the PlastiCharge additive to your Plastisol. So if you feel like a color doesn't have enough pop, it needs a little bit more oomph for color, you can drop that percentage of your PlastiCharge additive into your ink. I've gone as low as 33%, 1/3 PlastiCharge to 2/3 ink, and had fantastic success. Now, one more drawback, this is an evaporative product, so when you're printing, you still need to make sure that you're keeping that ink moist so it doesn't dry out. That does mean misting your ink on occasion and making sure that the ink is good to go. So enough with the preamble. Colin, get to printing already. First thing we want to do is, if we're mixing up our ink, we want to make sure that we have the colors we want. In this case today for this design, I have two Rio Pantone mix colors and 2 Rio spot color inks that I'm going to use. And I am going to do all my inks today at that 50-50 mix. We may print this and go, yeah, it does look a little faded, or we could go, it doesn't matter for this design. The design itself is going to be a little bit subtle. It's a rehash of a design that I've used a couple of times in the past. So we'll see how it turns out and make this into a learning experience for all of us. First thing we want to do, because it makes the mixing easier, we want to weigh out our PlastiCharge. Now, whenever you open PlastiCharge, you want to take a look at it. Most of the time, it's going to start to separate just a little bit. Now, depending on how old it is, it could separate a little bit more. So I'm going to pull the lid off of here, and then we're going to take a look inside and give it a little stir. It's very common, again, for it to separate just a little bit, especially over time. Give that a real good stir. It's going to start to look a little milky, totally normal. You're going to reintroduce some air into it, so it's going to start to look like maybe a little bit of candy, and don't eat it. Totally normal. First thing I'm going to do is, after I've mixed this up, is I'm going to weigh out half of the ink weight that I want. In this case, because we're only doing video, we're only printing for the video, I don't need any more than 100 to 200 grams. So I'm going to err on the side of caution. I'm going to mix up 200 grams, but that means I need 100 grams of the PlastiCharge and 100 grams of my ink. Now, as I'm stirring that up, you're going to notice that it's kind of an oil and water effect, because literally it's oil and water. It's Plastisol ink and a water-based product. But they do eventually end up mixing up. You can see that they don't want to play nice. Just keep stirring. Even the colors that don't look like they're blending together that quickly will eventually blend together. Now, when we go to add our activator, we're only adding activator to the amount of PlastiCharge that we've added, that we were using in the ink. In this case, that's 100 grams. So I'm going to take 5%, add 5% activator to that base. So in this case, it's going to be 5 grams. But if you do 1,000 grams, then you're adding 50 grams of activator. Now, there are going to be times when the ink and the PlastiCharge additive don't want to blend together as easy as others do. As you could see here with the red, it's fighting it a little bit. And so I needed to stir for a long period of time in order to get them to blend as well as they have here. Now, once you get this on screen, it's actually going to end up printing just fine. Always test, because there could be something wonky going on in your mix for whatever reason. That's just the production guy in me throwing out warnings. I know that once I get this red in screen and I start pulling a squeegee, that mesh count and the action of a flood and a print and a flood and a print is going to end up keeping it well dispersed, and it's going to end up looking great on the garment. If it doesn't, we'll troubleshoot at the end and figure it out. All right, let's get on press and start pulling some squeegees. In our last video, I gave you some tips about how to register a multicolor discharge job. In this case, because we're working with Plastisol, which is going to be one of the components in our Plastisol Discharge mix, I registered my design with Plastisol. So all I need to do now is clean out the bulk of the ink and then put my Plastisol mix back into the screen and pull a squeegee a few times. I'm going to print this with my registration marks, confirm that everything is in place and hasn't moved, and confirm that the discharge process is properly happening. We can see what should be a really well-covering cream color does not have a whole lot of coverage. That's because of the 50% split that we're doing in the ink. Okay, so my red needs to go down a little bit. Other than that, throw that shirt through the dryer. Okay, so this was an initial pass through of the color, clearing out the Plastisol ink. Looks like I need to do a couple more. Registration's pretty close. It's relatively soft considering that this was 158 mesh printing through here. Still need to make sure that my colors that didn't fully emulsify, that they end up looking better. So I'm going to print 2 shirts back to back and see how much better I can get that print to look. All right, that red is not playing nice. Okay, so I just did that first one on black, and the cream definitely looks washed out, pale. So what I want to do is I want to flash that to see if I can keep some of that brightness going into the other inks. I muddled my way through it, trying to figure out what our best print order for this should be. We did a print on the back of this garment here. Everything looked a little dull, and I felt that the first screen down, that cream was just losing a lot of its pop. So I ended up changing what I did just a little bit. I flashed it and then went on to my other colors, and I'm happy with how this has turned out. We're currently at 1:15 through the dryer. All we need to do is make sure that the Plastisol additive gets a full evaporation, gets that discharge going, and then the Plastisol ink that's left over gets a full cure so it can bond to the fabric properly. Overall, this is pretty thin. You saw me printing wet on wet. I hadn't talked about my screens yet. These are all 158 mesh. I was 2-stroking through 158 mesh and printing wet on wet. Normally you don't do that. But because the ink is thin enough and it goes into the fabric, you can do a lot with the 158 mesh. Test it in your shop, do what's necessary. Now, I did lose a little bit of registration. I did not go chasing it because I was fighting in the red and in my cream a little bit of that oil and water separation that you get from the Plastisol and from the PlastiCharge. Unfortunately, that's totally normal. It depends on the inks that you're using and how well they combine. If you're on the auto, the squeegee and flood bar is constantly going, so they're always mixed up and they're homogenized really nice. They emulsify really nicely. On a manual press, you're printing that color every now and then so it can separate, and then you go back and print it and it can separate. It's just like a salad dressing. You got to keep it flowing. When we're talking about opacity of your color, I feel like my red did die just a little bit. Now, when I added my discharge activator, I did not use my normal 5% activator, I did a 4% activator. And that's because the discharge activator can end up oxidizing red pigments, certain red pigments. So I like to say it chews it up. Visually, it either makes it disappear or it can turn it a little brown. It depends on a couple of factors. I might change my ratio of the PlastiCharge into the real mixing colors. I might go to a 60% Plastisol, maybe even head up to that 70% Plastisol, and the lower amounts of PlastiCharge in order to keep that brightness. Because remember, at the beginning of our conversation, we talked about how important the ink's natural opacity is. If the ink doesn't have high levels of coverage, we're cutting out its ability to cover, regardless of how well the discharge process is happening and the color of the garment that's left over. Because that ink that pigment load is still now so thin, you can see that shirt color come through more and influence the color of the ink. I reached a point where I like what I've got. Next run, I would change the ratios a little bit, but between this jade sage, the sage t-shirt color, and the black, the colors look pretty good. You can see the influence of the shirt color here in the cream between the two color shades and the brightness of the red. You can see how that shirt color ground is coming through and influencing just a little bit. This is the basics of what is PlastiCharge printing. Some of us love it. It works great in our production flows. Others are like, okay, I tried it. I want to go to discharge, and it's all up to you. But now that you're educated, you can make that choice as to what's going to work better in your shop. That's going to do it for a run on discharge education for a while. If you have any, last minute questions, throw them in the comments down below. As you can see, we always try to engage with you guys and get some real good discourse happen. So if you learned something here, we would love it if you gave us a like and a subscribe. Throw us a share. We'd really appreciate it. Thank you, everybody. We'll see you in the next one. You can start the cleanup of your screen with water to get out a good chunk of the ink, but you still got to finish up cleaning with a good Plastisol ink degradant.